reason for this is that before I can accept your plea of guilty, I must determine that there's a factual basis in the Commonwealth's evidence for your plea of guilty. And I must be certain that you understand, accept, and agree with the facts and the evidence that would be presented against you.
Thank you. In April of 2010, officials at the town of Westford school department's maintenance facility noticed that expensive equipment and tools were disappearing from the main office. Richard Crocker, the facilities manager at the school maintenance building, suspected that the defendant before you, the animal control officer Michael Harrington, was responsible for these thefts. Crocker informed the Westford police that over approximately a 3-week period, several tools and other pieces of equipment had, quote, gone missing from the building's garage. Crocker reported that the building is secured during off hours and there were no signs of a break-in or forced entry. Crocker also stated that he and his employees share the facilities building with the animal control unit, which is run by the defendant, in which the defendant had access to 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In an attempt to discover who was responsible for stealing the department's equipment, on Friday, April 9th, Mr. Crocker repositioned a surveillance camera at the facility to record the entrance to the garage near Mr. Harrington's office. Mr. Crocker also conducted an inventory of the remaining equipment at the facility. And on Monday, April 12th, Mr. Crocker noticed that a chainsaw valued at approximately $300, a power broom valued at $800, and an impact gun, which is not a firearm but a nail gun, valued at $300 were missing. Upon review of Sunday's surveillance video, Crocker observed the defendant enter the building at approximately 5:20 p.m. Mr. Crocker stated that Harrington was next observed leaving the building with what appeared to be the power broom in his hand. On Monday, April 12th, Mr. Crocker contacted Detective James Peliquin and informed him that more equipment was missing from the facilities building. Mr. Crocker also informed Mr. Peliquin that the video camera captured the defendant leaving the building with the power broom. During the investigation, Westford police questioned the defendant about the theft of the equipment from the facilities building. During that conversation, the defendant initially denied taking anything from the building, but upon being confronted with a still photo produced from the video, admitted to stealing 4 tools, the 3 listed tools above and a DeWalt drill set valued at $260. Based in part on the defendant's statements, a search warrant was obtained for the defendant's home, and during the search warrant, the power broom was recovered. During the investigation, Detective Peliquin asked the defendant about the whereabouts of numerous firearms that were issued to the animal control unit. The defendant stated that the firearms belonging to the animal control unit were still currently secured in his office. He stated that they were all locked with trigger locks and they were inside a large cabinet that had handles that locked. Harrington stated that he had ordered new guns for the department but had not distributed them yet because he was waiting for his people to take a gun safety course. Harrington also stated that he was in his office on Thursday or Friday, which would have been 4 or 5 days prior to the interview, and he saw the guns in his office at that point. Records show that Harrington logged onto his computer on Friday the 9th, and video surveillance depicted Harrington entering the building on the same day. Harrington also stated that although many people have access to the main building, his office is always locked and no one else has access to it. After speaking to Harrington, the Westford police searched Harrington's office and determined that 11 firearms issued to Harrington in his department were missing, and the cabinet that Harrington described did not exist. Detective Peliquin went back to Harrington and informed him that the guns were not in his office, to which Harrington stated that he had secured them in the office in there last week, and that was, quote, all he knew about the guns. During the investigation, police also learned that the defendant had collected 4 firearms from the animal control unit in February or March of 2010, and had also taken possession himself of the 8 new firearms he had ordered for the unit. During the initial interview, Harrington also stated that he would trade tools to a guy named Al up in Lowell. And Harrington also stated he had a drug problem and would trade tools for drugs. On Friday, April 9th, Lowell police arrested an Alberto Ramos for possession of a firearm. When Lowell police entered the serial number from their recovered gun into the database, they discovered that the gun was reported stolen from the town of Westford. And that was indeed one of the guns that Mr. Harrington stole. In August of 2010, a firearm was recovered from a search warrant in Boston. That firearm was also traced back to being one of the guns that was taken from the town of Westford. During one of the searches, Westford police also found a water cooler valued at under $250 that belonged to the town of Westford. And finally, with regard to the improper storage of a firearm, a rifle or shotgun, during the investigation it was discovered that Mr. Harrington had a girlfriend, and her girlfriend's parents received a shotgun and a rifle from Mr. Harrington. When they found out that the rifle and shotgun were stolen, the rifle and shotgun were returned to Mr. Harrington. That rifle and shotgun, either by Mr. Harrington or by a joint venture theory, ended up in a lake in Tingsboro, and that is the basis for the failure to secure a firearm. Those are the facts of the case, Your Honor.
Thank you.
The Commonwealth's request for sentencing is for 2010 docket number 537, counts 5 through 15, commitment in the state prison for a term of not less than 3 years and not more than 5 years. On 2010 537, counts 1 through 4 and 16, as well as 2010 1288, counts 1 and 2, 5 years probation from and after the period of incarceration that the Commonwealth is requesting. In addition, as laid out in the Commonwealth sentencing memo, the Commonwealth asks for certain conditions of probation, which are as follows: that the defendant shall stay away from the town of Westford school maintenance building located at 30 Beacon Street in Westford, that the defendant pay full restitution to the town of Westford in the amount of $6,013, that the defendant submit to a drug evaluation and complete all required follow-up treatment as well as random drug screens, that the defendant, if he has not already, surrender and refrain from possessing any and all guns, ammunition, badges, official clothing from the town of Westford, and official clothing from the town of Tingsboro Animal Control Department. That the defendant, if he has not already, surrender a license to carry his firearm or firearm identification card, and that for his period of probation he agree not to apply for a license to carry or apply for a firearm identification card. On the last court date, the court was kind enough to hear us at sidebar on the record about the Commonwealth's request for sentencing. I will rest on that, plus my sentencing memorandum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Your Honor, I understand what the court has recommended. What I had asked for was the 2 years health and correction. This is basically a situation that stems from a medical situation. Your Honor, my client had severe injuries a few years ago, and which resulted in some substance abuse issues, and everything hinges on that. As you heard, he was a dog officer. He's an animal trainer, and he has a lot of empathy for people and dogs and things like that, and had always been responsible about that issue, maintaining those licenses until this one issue interfered with his ability to do so. As you heard, he cooperated with the police in making a statement, and has cooperated to the extent that he was able to do so with regards to the location of things. However, and as you heard, he has indicated that he is guilty. He does have some heart issues that result in the medication put in, and other issues that I addressed at sidebar that I asked that he make sure that there's medical attention given to him. As you heard, he's 46 years old. He's going to be out for a period of time in a Billerica House of Correction, and then there'll be very close supervision for a long period of time. So therefore, I'm making the request for the 2 years house of correction.
Thank you. I have considered the facts of this case. The guidelines I've determined are too low for the seriousness of these crimes because of their larceny. Over 250, the guidelines have it as a 0 to 12-month incarceration period. That does not reflect the seriousness of the crimes and the breach of trust that the defendant committed as an officer of the town of Westford by taking these guns. The seriousness of the crimes is emphasized because they ended up in the hands of, we know, 2 other individuals that were then found in possession of them and charged with crimes themselves. and other guns are still missing. But the crimes before me, the charges are larceny and firearm, not that the defendant distributed them, which would have carried a far greater potential penalty in the case. So I do think the guidelines are too low, and that's why I think a longer period of incarceration is important in this case. I've also considered, however, that the defendant had no record except an OUI in 1986, and that's why I've considered and decided to impose a House of Corrections sentence in lieu of a state prison sentence. So on counts 2010 53705, you stand up now, sir. Will sentence the defendant to 2 years committed in the House of Correction on indictment 537006. Sentence the defendant to 2 years in the House of Correction from and after the committed sentence on 00.